The stars outside the viewport flickered like dying embers, cold and distant. Commander Eric Hale stood at the center of the bridge, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his gaze hard and unwavering. The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence, a steady undercurrent to the tension in the air. The crew sat at their stations, faces tight with apprehension as they awaited the incoming transmission. Hale's dark eyes didn't waver from the massive holographic display at the front of the room. An image of the enemy fleet, sharp and predatory, advancing toward Earth's orbit. Thousands of ships, each one bristling with alien technology that humanity could barely comprehend, let alone match. Transmission incoming, the communications officer reported, her voice strained. Put it through, Hale ordered, his voice steady. The holographic display flickered, and then the image of the Valtteri general filled the screen. His form was tall and slender, his skin the color of polished steel. His eyes were devoid of pupils, black pools of emptiness. His mouth curled in what might have been a smile, cold, calculating. The general wore armor that pulsed faintly with blue energy, the symbols of his rank etched into the metal. Behind him, the blurred figures of his crew moved with mechanical precision. Humans, the general said, his voice like ice scraping over metal. We have tolerated your defiance for long enough. Hale's jaw tightened. And what exactly have we done to offend your sensibilities this time? The general's expression didn't change. You exist. A ripple of unease swept through the bridge crew. Hale's eyes narrowed. We offered you a chance to submit, the general continued, to join the order of the galaxy under Valtteri rule. You refused. His eyes glinted. Now you will face the consequences. The stars outside the viewport seemed to darken. A low tremor passed through the ship as the enemy fleet adjusted its formation. Hale could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the inevitability of destruction. You have 24 hours to surrender, the general said. His gaze sharpened, cold and merciless. If you refuse, we'll torch your worlds. The transmission cut off. Silence. The crew exchanged tense glances, the weight of the threat settling like a stone in their chests. The tactical officer, Lieutenant Park, turned from his station, her face pale. They have enough firepower to glass every major city on Earth, she said. And the colonies. They won't stop at Earth, Hale said quietly. If we fall, they'll burn everything we've built, every colony, every outpost. They'll erase humanity from the stars. Park's hand trembled as she typed at her console. Sir, our fleet is outnumbered, nearly 10-1. Hale's gaze didn't shift from the viewport. The enemy ships were forming a blockade, a wall of death between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. What are your orders, sir? Hale's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of every life under his command pressing down on him. Millions of civilians, families, soldiers who had fought and bled for humanity's survival. If they surrendered, they would live under Valtteri rule, as slaves at best, as corpses at worst. But if they fought, they expect us to surrender, Hale said. Park hesitated. Sir, they think we're weak, Hale continued. His eyes hardened. They've always thought that. The doors at the back of the bridge slid open. Admiral Carson stepped inside, her uniform crisp despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the grim expressions on the crew's faces. I assume you heard, Hale said. I heard, Carson replied. She approached the viewport, her arms crossed. And we fight, Hale said. His voice was steel. Park's eyes widened. Sir, they'll glass Earth if we do nothing, Hale cut in. His tone sharpened, daring anyone to challenge him. We have one chance, one strike before they consolidate their position. Carson's eyes narrowed. You have a plan. Hale smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. They want to torch our worlds. Hale's gaze turned cold. Then we'll burn theirs first. A ripple of stunned silence passed through the crew. You're talking about a direct strike, Carson said, her voice low. On their fleet? Not just their fleet, Hale said. We hit their command ship. We take out their leadership, fracture their chain of command. Park's fingers hovered above her console. Sir, their command ship is shielded. We'd have to get close, within weapons range. Hale's smile faded. We'll use the cloaking systems, the new prototypes. Carson's expression darkened. They've never been tested in combat. Then it's time we tested them, Hale replied. The Admiral studied him for a long moment. This is suicide. Hale's eyes met hers. Cold, determined. If we don't act, we lose everything, he said. If we fight, we might survive. Carson's gaze lingered on him, and then she nodded slowly. You'll need a strike team, she said. Someone to breach the command ship. I'll lead it myself, Hale said. Carson's eyes sharpened. Commander, I won't order my men to face that kind of danger unless I'm willing to face it myself, Hale interrupted. His gaze was hard. Besides, this needs to be personal. Carson hesitated. Then she sighed. You're a stubborn bastard, Hale. Hale smiled faintly. That's why you promoted me. Park's console beeped sharply. She turned toward it, her face paling. Sir, the Volteri fleet is moving. Hale's gaze sharpened. Toward Earth. No, Park whispered. They're repositioning. Hale's brow furrowed. Why? The answer came a moment later. A new transmission appeared on the screen. The general's face returned, a cold smile on his metallic lips. You think you have a chance, the general said, almost amused. That's adorable. Behind him, the image shifted. The Volteri fleet's weapons began to glow. Charge. Primed. You have 24 hours, the general repeated. But why wait? Hale's blood turned cold. We'll start with your colonies, the general said softly. Consider it. Motivation. The transmission cut off. A sharp alarm blared through the ship. Park's voice was tight with panic. Sir, enemy vessels have entered the Alpha Colony sector. They're charging weapons. Hale's hand tightened into a fist. Get me a direct link to the fleet, he ordered. His voice was steadied, despite the fire burning in his chest. Park's fingers flew over the console. A moment later, the faces of the fleet's commanding officers filled the display. Hale's gaze swept over them, men and women hardened by war, waiting for orders. This is Commander Hale, he said, his voice like iron. Prepare for immediate deployment. A pause. Then Carson's voice. Orders, Commander. Hale's gaze turned cold. We're not going to wait, he said. We hit them first. Silence. Then Carson's reply. Understood. Hale's jaw clenched. His gaze drifted toward the viewport, toward the distant shape of the Volteri fleet. They want a war. Hale's voice was low, dangerous. Let's give them one. The ship's engines roared beneath Commander Hale's feet as the human fleet prepared for launch. The hum of power surged through the walls of the ship, a deep vibration that settled into the bones of every soldier aboard. Hale stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie, Earth's most advanced warship, as the fleet around him formed up in perfect battle formation. Rows of steel-gray hulls floated against the backdrop of space, their lights gleaming like predator eyes in the dark. The distant stars were swallowed by the looming shadow of the Volteri Armada. Thousands of warships, sleek and deadly, waited in menacing silence, their weapons charged and ready to strike. Fleet is in position. Sir, Lieutenant Park reported. Her fingers hovered above the tactical console, tension carved into every line of her face. Hale's eyes remained fixed on the display in front of him. The Volteri command ship sat at the heart of their formation, massive and heavily shielded, its dark hull pulsing with energy. The Volteri general was confident, arrogant. He believed humanity would fold under the pressure. He believed this would be easy. He was wrong. Status on the cloaking systems? Hale asked. They're holding, Park replied. But we'll only get one pass before they detect us. Hale's gaze sharpened. One pass is all we need. Admiral Carson's face appeared on the screen beside him. Her expression was hard, her gray hair pulled back tightly. All strike teams are ready. We'll need to punch through their outer defenses fast. Those shields won't hold forever. They won't need to, Hale said. His voice was steady. We take out their command ship, and the fleet will crumble. Carson's gaze narrowed. You sure about that? Hale's jaw tightened. If I'm wrong, we die. Simple as that. Carson smiled faintly. Glad you're seeing things clearly. A soft chime echoed through the ship. The final signal. The fleet was locked and ready for launch. Hale turned toward the bridge crew. Their faces were pale, but their eyes were hard. Fear was there, but so was resolve. All ships, Hale said. On my mark. The stars outside the viewport seemed to dim. The enemy fleet was shifting, positioning itself to intercept any movement. Hale could feel the tension thrumming beneath his skin, the electric pull of impending violence. 3. Weapon systems powered up across the fleet, their red lights gleaming. 2. Engines flared, the dark hulls of the human ships glowing beneath the growing heat. 1. Engage. The human fleet surged forward as one, engines igniting with bursts of blue and white light. Hale's ship lurched beneath him as the acceleration pressed him into his seat. Outside the viewport, the stars blurred, and the Valtteri ships swelled in size as the distance closed rapidly. The Valtteri responded instantly. Their weapon systems flashed, sending bursts of plasma fire streaking through the darkness. The first human ship took a direct hit to the hull. An explosion of metal and flame rippled outward as the ship disintegrated. Stay in formation, Hale barked. The fleet tightened, weaving through the incoming fire with practiced precision. Shields flared, absorbing glancing shots. Hale's eyes narrowed as the Valtteri formation shifted, their ships moving to intercept. They're funneling us toward their flanks, Park said. They think they've got us, Hale replied. His hand tightened on the armrest. Let them think it. The cloaking systems activated, and the human ships shimmered, disappearing from view. The Valtteri ships hesitated. Scanning pulses fired into the darkness, searching for targets. Hale's lips curled. Take us in. The Valkyries slipped between the enemy ships, engines burning low. The massive black hulls of the Valtteri cruisers loomed overhead, their underbellies bristling with turrets and missile ports. The human fleet moved like ghosts, shadows in the dark. Target locked, Park said. Fire, Hale ordered. The Valkyries' railguns erupted with a deafening blast. Red-hot rounds tore through the hull of the nearest Valtteri cruiser. The ship detonated, sending shrapnel spinning through the vacuum. Explosions rippled across the Valtteri line as the other human ships joined the assault. Plasma beams lanced through the darkness, cutting through Valtteri hulls with surgical precision. They're shifting position, Park reported, trying to reinforce the command ship. Not fast enough, Hale said. The human fleet pressed forward, cutting a burning path toward the heart of the Valtteri formation. Ships exploded on both sides, burning debris scattered through the black void. A human cruiser broke apart as a direct plasma strike punctured its core. Hale's jaw tightened. Report. Olympus is down, Park said, her voice tight. Hale's hand slammed against the console. Lives, hundreds of them, gone in an instant, but there was no time to grieve. We're almost there, Carson's voice cut through the noise. But that command ship. Leave it to me, Hale said. Park's eyes widened. Sir, you heard me. The Valkyrie surged forward, engines flaring. The command ship loomed ahead, a dark, monstrous shadow against the stars. Its shields pulsed with blue light. Charge the core cannon, Hale ordered. Park hesitated. Sir, if the shield holds. We'll find out. The cannon's charge built to a deafening hum. The command ship's weapons shifted, targeting the Valkyrie. Sir, incoming. The command ship fired. A blinding lance of plasma energy roared toward them. Hale's eyes sharpened. Fire. The Valkyrie's core cannon discharge. A blinding beam of blue-white light surged forward, colliding with the plasma blast. The two beams met in a searing clash of energy, and then the core cannon broke through. The beam struck the command ship's shields. The blue barrier flickered, then shattered. Direct hit, Park shouted. The command ship's hull erupted in a burst of white-hot metal. The Valkyrie ship listed, its systems failing. Explosions rippled along its surface. Hale's gaze sharpened. Target their bridge. Sir, do it. The Valkyrie fired again. The beam cut through the command ship's bridge. The massive ship shuddered, its engines stuttering. The burning wreckage began to list toward the gravity well of a nearby planet. Inside the command ship, the holographic form of the Valkyrie general flickered onto the display. His dark eyes were wide, his cold expression fractured by the edges of fear. You, the general hissed. Hale's gaze was ice. You thought this would be easy, Hale said coldly. You thought humanity would kneel. The general's mouth curled in rage. We're not done, he snarled. Oh, Hale smiled faintly. I think you are. The screen flickered and died. The command ship detonated in a violent explosion, a shockwave rippling through the enemy fleet. Valkyrie ships faltered, confused and leaderless. Hale's voice rang out across the fleet channel. All ships, press the attack. The human fleet surged forward, cutting into the heart of the disorganized Valkyrie line. Explosions lit up the darkness. Ships burned. Park's gaze turned toward Hale. Sir, we're winning. Hale's expression remained hard. Not yet, he said. Not until they're running. Outside the viewport, the Valkyrie fleet began to break apart. Ships retreated, engines flaring as they fled into the depths of space. Hale's gaze hardened. Chase them down, he said, and make sure they remember what happens when they threaten humanity. The battlefield was littered with the burning wreckage of ships. Twisted metal floated silently in the black void, illuminated only by the flickering remains of plasma fires. The human fleet hung in the darkness like wounded predators, their hulls scared and engines sputtering. But they had won. For now, the Valkyrie fleet was in full retreat, their remaining ships disappearing into the depths of space. Commander Hale stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie, his gaze fixed on the broken remains of the Valkyrie command ship. Sparks flickered across the ruined hull, pieces of metal breaking away and drifting aimlessly through the void. The general was dead, but Hale knew it wasn't over. The Valkyrie were too proud, too ruthless to let a defeat like this go unanswered. Damage report, Hale said, his voice low. Lieutenant Park's hands hovered over the tactical console. We lost Olympus and Drake, she said, her voice tight. Casualties across the fleet are severe. Hale's jaw clenched. He already knew what that meant. Thousands of lives gone. He could still see the Olympus's final moments in his mind. The ship breaking apart under the weight of plasma fire, the desperate cries of the crew as the hull breached and fire consumed them. Park hesitated. Sir, Bonner's team. Hale's gaze sharpened. They were on the Drake, Park said. A cold weight settled in Hale's chest. Survivors. Park shook her head. None. Hale's breath left him in a slow exhale. Bonner. The man had been with him for years, through every campaign, every impossible battle. They had fought side by side more times than Hale could count. And now, gone. Hale's hand curled into a fist. His gaze drifted toward the viewport. Beyond the broken remnants of the battle, the stars stretched out endlessly. Cold, silent, uncaring. He could feel the emptiness pressing against the walls of the ship, the vastness of space swallowing the weight of human lives as if they had never mattered. The bridge was quiet. Too quiet. The crew sat at their stations, their faces pale and drawn. There was no celebration, no relief, just the heavy silence of survival. Admiral Carson's face appeared on the main display. Her expression was hard, but Hale could see the strain beneath it. The exhaustion, the grief. "Hale," she said. "Admiral." "You did well," Carson said. "We drove them back." "Barely." Hale's tone was cold. Carson's gaze narrowed. "It's a victory." "At what cost?" Hale replied. Carson's eyes darkened. "You know the answer to that." Before Hale could respond, a chime sounded through the bridge. A high-pitched alert. "Incoming transmission." Park's head snapped toward the console. "Sir, transmission from Valtteri Prime." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Put it through." The screen flickered, and the face of a Valtteri lord appeared. His features were sharp and angular, his pale skin marked with the intricate black tattoos of his rank. His yellow eyes gleamed with cold fury beneath the dark crest of his crown. "You will regret this," the Valtteri lord hissed. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of steel. "You started this," Hale replied. The lord's expression twisted into something dangerous. "You have made an enemy of the Valtteri Empire." "You've always been our enemy," Hale said. "You think you've won." The lord's smile was thin and venomous. "We've only just begun." The screen cut out. The bridge lights dimmed as the transmission ended. A sharp silence filled the air. "Sir," Park said, her voice tight, "Valtteri ships are reappearing on long-range scanners. Hundreds of them." Hale's gaze darkened. "Incoming." Park swallowed. "No. They're regrouping near the outer colonies." Hale's breath sharpened. "They're not targeting us," Park said. Realization struck like ice down his spine. "No," Hale said. "They're going after the civilians." An alarm blared through the ship as the Valtteri fleet jumped into position near the outer human colonies. The display screen lit up with new signals, hostile ships swarming toward defenseless human worlds. "They're going to burn the colonies," Park said. "Set a course," Hale ordered. "Now." Park's hands flew over the controls. "Sir, even if we go full burn, we won't make it in time." Hale's jaw tightened. "We have to try." The fleet shifted, engines flaring as they turned toward the colonies. But the Valtteri were already too close. On the display, the first colony world appeared. A green-blue planet with swirling clouds and bright oceans. It was peaceful, untouched, but the Valtteri ships were closing in. "Open a channel," Hale said. A crackle of static, then the face of a colony governor appeared on the screen. A middle-aged man with tired eyes and gray at his temples. He looked confused. "Commander Hale." "You need to evacuate," Hale said sharply. The governor's brow furrowed. "Why? What's happening?" Before Hale could respond, the screen flickered, and then the first Valtteri ship fired. A crimson beam of light struck the surface of the planet. The camera shook. A deafening roar filled the channel. Behind the governor, fire erupted across the horizon. "Oh my God," the governor whispered. More beams fired. The ground split apart. Whole cities collapsed beneath the assault. People were running, screaming, but there was nowhere to go. Hale's eyes darkened. "Get your people out of there." The governor turned toward the camera, his face pale with terror. "We can't. The transport systems are down." The transmission cut out. The screen went dark. "No signal," Park said. Her voice was hollow. Hale's hands curled into fists. "What's the status of the colony?" Park's voice was barely a whisper. "Surface integrity. Failing." Hale's throat tightened. He could see the planet through the viewport now. It was burning. Whole sections of the atmosphere were lit up with flames. The colony's orbital stations were breaking apart, falling into the atmosphere like dying stars. "Sir," Park whispered, "we can't save them." Hale's jaw tightened. His gaze sharpened. "We're going to make them pay for this." A sudden explosion rippled through the fleet. Hale steadied himself against the console as the ship rocked violently. "Enemy ships approaching," Park shouted. The Valtteri fleet was advancing. cutting off the human ships from the burning colony. "Fire at will," Hale ordered. The Valkyrie's weapon systems roared to life. The ship surged forward, plasma beams cutting through the dark. Human and Valkyrie ships clashed in a brutal exchange of fire. Hulls broke apart. Metal and flames scattered through the void. But it was too late. The colony was gone. Hale's gaze turned toward the viewport. Smoke and fire trailed across the ruined surface of the planet. A once thriving colony, reduced to ash. A single burning thought pulsed through his mind. They will pay for this. Every last one of them. The silence on the bridge of the Valkyrie was suffocating. The burning remains of the colony planet still flickered on the display screen. The planet's once blue atmosphere now clouded with black smoke and fire. The Valkyrie had left nothing behind. No survivors, no cities, just ruin and ash. Commander Hale stood rigid at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the distant wreckage. His hands were curled into fists at his sides. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. His crew sat at their stations, their faces pale and hollow. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Lieutenant Park's voice broke the silence. "Sir," Admiral Carson on the line. "Put her through," Hale said. Carson's face appeared on the screen, her sharp eyes dark and shadowed. The tension in her expression mirrored the weight in Hale's chest. "Hale," Carson said. "Admiral, you saw what they did." Hale's throat tightened. "I saw. They've made their position clear," Carson said. "They don't want peace. They want annihilation. They'll burn every colony," Hale said. "Every human world." Carson's gaze hardened. "Unless we stop them." Hale's eyes narrowed. "How?" Carson hesitated. "We have one chance," she said. "A desperate one." Hale's jaw twitched. "I'm listening." Carson's gaze sharpened. "The Valkyrie fleet is being coordinated from a single command vessel, a Dreadnought-class ship. Massive, deep within Valkyrie-controlled space." Hale's eyes narrowed. "If we take out the Dreadnought, the fleet will collapse," Carson said. "Without their central command, their ships will lose coordination. They'll be vulnerable." Hale's breath quickened. "What's the catch?" Carson's expression darkened. "It's protected by a planetary defense grid, plasma turrets, missile platforms. It's practically impenetrable." "Practically," Hale repeated. Carson's eyes sharpened. "There's a weakness." Hale leaned closer. "Where?" "There's a small gap in the defense grid," Carson said. "An old maintenance tunnel that leads directly beneath the Dreadnought's shield array. It's narrow. Only a single strike team could fit." Hale's gaze darkened. "And once we're inside," Carson's expression tightened, "you'd have to overload the Dreadnought's reactor core manually. From inside." Hale's jaw tightened. "It's a suicide mission." "Possibly," Carson said. "But if it works, it could end the war." Hale was silent for a moment. His gaze drifted back to the burning planet. His thoughts darkened with the faces of the colony's people, the screams over the comms, the burning cities, the shattered lives. Bonner's face flashed in his mind. "They didn't hesitate," Hale said. "Neither will I." Carson's gaze softened. "You'll need a team." "I know who to bring," Hale said. Carson hesitated. "Hale, if this goes wrong, we die," Hale finished. "But if we don't try, humanity dies." Carson nodded slowly. "You have my authorization. Good luck, Commander." The screen went dark. Hale turned toward his crew. "Park," Hale said. "Sir, assemble a strike team. Full tactical gear. We move in 1 hour." Park hesitated. "Sir, if the intel is wrong." "It's not." Hale's voice was hard. Park's gaze sharpened. "Yes, sir." Hale strode toward the weapons locker, his pulse steady but sharp. He keyed in his access code, and the locker slid open with a hiss. Rows of rifles and sidearms gleamed under the dim lights. Hale reached for his personal sidearm, Feeling the cold weight settle into his hand, he holstered it at his side. Behind him, the sound of footsteps. "Sir," a voice said. Hale turned. Corporal Vickers stood at attention, his rifle slung across his chest. Behind him were Sergeant Cole and Lieutenant Harris. Their faces were hard, grim, but there was no hesitation in their eyes. "We heard the plan," Vickers said. "We're in." Hale's gaze sharpened. "It's a suicide mission." Cole's mouth curled into a thin smile. "Then we better make it count." Hale's chest tightened. He nodded. "Suit up," he said. "We deploy in 1 hour." The team assembled in the drop bay. 7 soldiers, clad in dark armor, rifles locked and loaded. Vickers, Cole, Harris, and 4 others from the elite strike division. Their faces were hidden behind their helmets, but Hale could feel their resolve. The dropship hummed beneath their feet. The bay doors sealed with a heavy clang. The ship's engines thrummed to life. "Commander," Park's voice crackled through the comm. "We have a clear path to the dreadnought's location, but the window is closing fast." "Copy that," Hale said. "Take us in." The ship jolted as it left the docking bay. Through the viewport, the blackness of space stretched out before them. Distant stars shimmered. And beyond them, the distant shadow of the Valtteri dreadnought, its dark hull gleaming beneath the light of a nearby sun. "Approaching target," Park's voice said. Hale's gaze sharpened. His team stood at the ready, rifles in hand. No one spoke. No one flinched. "Stand by," Hale said. The ship cut through the Valtteri defense perimeter. Red lights flared across the control panel as enemy scanners detected their approach. A sudden tremor rippled through the hull. "Enemy fire incoming," Park shouted. "Hold course," Hale said. The ship weaved through a hail of plasma fire, the hull vibrating with each near miss. Explosions flashed outside the viewport. "We're through," Park called. "Opening bay doors," Hale ordered. The bay doors hissed open. Cold air rushed in. Beyond the doors, the hull of the dreadnought loomed, dark and enormous. "Move," Hale shouted. The team jumped. Thrusters flared at their backs as they launched toward the dreadnought. Hale's boots struck the hull, magnetic locks engaging as he landed. His team formed up behind him. "Find the maintenance tunnel," Hale ordered. Harris knelt by a control panel, his fingers flying over the surface. "Found it," Harris said. "Sealing mechanism engaged." Cole knelt beside him, pulling a small charge from his belt. "Let's knock." A dull thunk as the charge locked onto the panel. A second later, an explosion. The hatch slid open. "Move," Hale ordered. They descended into darkness. The narrow tunnel stretched before them, lined with flickering red lights. Hale's breath sounded loud inside his helmet. His rifle was steady in his hands. "We've got movement," Vickers said. Hale's eyes narrowed. A sudden blur of motion, and then the tunnel exploded with plasma fire. "Cover," Hale shouted. Valtteri soldiers surged from the shadows, their tall, angular forms shrouded in dark armor. Plasma bolts lit up the tunnel. Hale fired, cutting down 2 soldiers. Vickers dropped another with a headshot. "They know we're here," Harris shouted. "Keep moving," Hale ordered. The team pushed forward, rifles blazing. Plasma bolts flashed through the dark. Hale's heart hammered as he fired, cutting down another Valtteri soldier. The tunnel opened into a large chamber. At the center, the dreadnought's reactor core, massive, pulsing with energy. "This is it," Hale said. Cole pulled a detonator from his pack, setting the charge. A loud hiss, and then the chamber doors slammed shut. "Commander," Vickers said, "we've got company." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Hold them off." Vickers' grin sharpened. "With pleasure." Hale stood at the edge of the reactor chamber, rifle raised. The low hum of the dreadnought's core filled the air, vibrating through the metal beneath his boots. Bright blue energy pulsed through the massive conduits lining the walls, casting eerie shadows across the dark chamber. The reactor's core floated at the center of the room, a massive sphere of glowing energy suspended within a containment field. Behind Hale, Cole was crouched by the core's control panel, fingers working fast over the display. Sparks crackled from the damaged console. Red warning lights flashed across the room. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the tunnel behind them. Heavy, fast, closing in. "They're coming," Vickers said, standing near the door, rifle aimed down the dark corridor. Harris and the others stood beside him, their weapons ready. "Cole," Hale said, not taking his eyes off the door. "Almost there," Cole grunted. His fingers flew over the console. "Just need to bypass the failsafe." A plasma bolt streaked through the air. Vickers ducked, returning fire down the corridor. A Valtteri soldier crumpled to the ground, blue blood splattering the walls. Two more figures emerged from the shadows, tall, dark-armored, weapons raised. "Contact," Vickers shouted. He fired, cutting down another soldier. Harris followed with a burst of rifle fire, dropping the second. "We can't hold them off forever," Harris shouted. "Cole," Hale barked. "Got it." Cole's voice rose with triumph. He yanked a glowing control rod from the console. The core's blue light flared brighter. Alarms blared across the chamber. "Core destabilizing," Cole said. "We've got 5 minutes until meltdown." Hale's gaze sharpened. "Enough time to get out." Cole's expression darkened. "Maybe. Then let's move." Vickers fired another burst down the corridor. "They're regrouping." "Fall back," Hale shouted. Vickers tossed a grenade down the tunnel. A bright explosion rocked the corridor, sending bits of metal and debris flying. Harris pulled Cole away from the console. The team ran toward the exit. "Go, go, go," Hale shouted. The ship trembled beneath their feet as the core's energy field began to collapse. Blue arcs of electricity snapped across the walls. Heat pulsed through the air. The whole dreadnought was shaking apart. They reached the corridor. Valtteri soldiers were already waiting. A plasma bolt clipped Harris's shoulder. He grunted, falling to one knee. "Harris," Vickers shouted, dragging him upright. "I'm fine," Harris growled. He raised his rifle and fired down the hall, dropping another soldier. Hale covered their retreat, firing rapidly as the team moved toward the extraction point. His rifle's barrel glowed red-hot from the heat. The dreadnought's core was growing louder, the vibrations shaking the walls. 2 minutes, Cole shouted. They reached the hangar bay. The dropship was already powered up, engines humming. Park's voice crackled over the comm. "Commander, we've got to launch now." "We're coming," Hale shouted. The team ran across the hangar bay, plasma bolts streaking past them. Harris stumbled. Vickers grabbed him, hauling him forward. The bay doors slid open. 3 more Valtteri soldiers charged toward them. Hale spun, firing. He dropped one. Harris took down the second. The third raised his weapon. And Cole stepped in front of Hale. A plasma bolt struck Cole's chest. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, and he collapsed to the ground. "Cole," Hale shouted. Cole's body hit the metal floor. Hale's rifle flared. And the last Valtteri soldier dropped. Hale ran toward Cole, falling to his knees. Blood spread beneath Cole's armor. His breath was ragged, eyes half closed. "Cole," Hale said, pressing a hand to his chest. Cole's lips curled into a weak smile. "We did it," he whispered. "Stay with me," Hale growled. Cole's eyes fluttered. "Get them home." "Cole." Cole's hand slipped from Hale's grip. His breath shuddered and stopped. Hale's chest tightened. For a moment, everything else, the alarms, the shaking ship, the shouts, faded. "Commander," Vickers shouted, "we've got to go." Hale's gaze hardened. He pulled Cole's dog tags from his armor, curling them in his fist. Then he rose to his feet. "Move." They sprinted toward the dropship. The ramp closed behind them as the ship launched into space. Through the viewport, Hale watched as the dreadnought's hull fractured. Light flared from the reactor core. "Brace for shockwave," Park shouted. The dreadnought exploded. A massive wave of blue energy pulsed through space, ripping through the surrounding debris. The shockwave struck the dropship, sending it spinning. Park fought the controls. "Stabilizing," Park shouted. "We're clear." Hale's breath came fast and sharp. He sank into the nearest seat, his hand still curled around Cole's dog tags. Harris sat across from him, clutching his injured shoulder. Vickers sat beside him, his face pale beneath his helmet. No one spoke. Minutes passed. Then Park's voice cut through the silence. "Commander," she said. "Incoming transmission." "From who?" Hale asked. Park's gaze sharpened. "The Valtteri fleet." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Put it through." A shimmering figure appeared on the screen. A Valtteri admiral. His tall form was shrouded in dark robes, his face pale beneath the low light. "Human," the Valtteri said, his voice sharp. "We acknowledge your strength." Hale's gaze darkened. "You mean you acknowledge your defeat?" The admiral's jaw tightened. "Perhaps. The destruction of our command vessel was unexpected." "It was a warning," Hale said coldly. "We can destroy more." The admiral's gaze narrowed. "What do you want?" Hale's gaze hardened. "Leave human space. Permanently." The admiral's eyes flashed. "And if we don't?" Hale leaned closer. "Then we will burn your worlds to ash." The admiral's gaze darkened. After a moment, he said, "We will retreat." The transmission cut out. A long silence settled over the bridge. Vickers exhaled slowly. Harris leaned his head back against the wall. Park's voice softened. "We did it." Hale's hand curled around Cole's dog tags. His gaze remained fixed on the distant stars. "Yeah," Hale said quietly. "We did it." The dropship glided through the cold darkness of space, leaving the wreckage of the Valtteri dreadnought behind. Hale sat in the command seat, his hand still wrapped around Cole's dog tags. The weight of them pressed into his palm like a reminder, or a curse. Across the cabin, Harris was strapped into his seat, a medical patch on his shoulder. Vickers sat beside him, staring blankly at the floor. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence. Hale's gaze remained fixed on the viewport. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the glass, cold and indifferent. The Valtteri fleet had pulled back. Their warships were retreating, slipping into the shadows beyond the system's edge. Humanity had won, but it didn't feel like victory. Cole was gone. "Commander," Park's voice cut through the quiet. Hale's gaze sharpened. "What is it?" "Long-range sensors are picking up movement on the edge of the system," Park said. Her hands moved over the console. "It's a small Valtteri ship. They're requesting permission to dock." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "They're transmitting a diplomatic code," Park said. "They want to speak with you directly." Vickers sat up straighter. "It's probably a trap." Hale's jaw tightened. "Patch them through." The viewport flickered, and the image of the Valtteri admiral reappeared. His pale face was half-lit by the glow of his ship's command console. His dark eyes studied Hale carefully. "Human," the admiral said. "Admiral," Hale replied coldly. The admiral's expression darkened. "You have proven your strength." "You tested it," Hale said. His gaze was sharp. "That was your mistake." The admiral's jaw tightened. "We underestimated you." "That's an understatement," Hale said. The admiral's eyes narrowed. "The Valtteri Empire does not surrender lightly. But it seems the cost of war with humanity is higher than anticipated." Hale's hand curled around the dog tags. "It's not over," he said. "Not yet." A long silence stretched between them. Then the admiral's gaze darkened. "What do you want?" Hale's jaw tightened. His voice was cold and sharp. "Stay out of human space. No more patrols. No more ships near our colonies. No more interference. The Admiral's gaze flickered with quiet rage. And if we refuse? Hale leaned closer toward the screen. His eyes were hard. Then we will come for you, Hale said. His voice was low and sharp. We will bring fire and death to your homeworlds. We will tear your empire apart, piece by piece. The Admiral's gaze hardened. You would risk another war. Hale's eyes flashed dangerously. We already fought one. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, and we survived. The Admiral's gaze shifted. A flicker of uncertainty passed over his face. You are more dangerous than we anticipated. No, Hale said. We're more dangerous than you can imagine. The Admiral's expression tightened. Then he inclined his head slightly. We will withdraw, he said. Hale's gaze didn't waver. Good choice. The screen went dark. Vickers exhaled sharply. Did that just happen? Harris's gaze sharpened. They're really pulling back. Seems like it, Hale said. His voice was flat. Hell of a negotiation strategy, Vickers muttered. Hale's gaze remained fixed on the viewport. The Valtteri ships were fading from view, their dark silhouettes slipping into the blackness of deep space. His chest tightened. It was over. But it didn't feel like victory. The ship's engines hummed as they passed through the outer edge of the system. The battered remains of human warships floated among the debris. Broken hulls, shattered metal. The aftermath of the battle was scattered across the void. Hale's gaze darkened. We lost too much, Harris said quietly. Yeah, Hale replied. Silence settled over the cabin. Vickers leaned back, closing his eyes. Harris rubbed his shoulder, wincing from the wound beneath the bandage. Park's hands moved over the console, setting a course for the nearest human colony. Hale's hand drifted to his chest. His fingers brushed the cold metal of Cole's dog tags. His throat tightened. Cole should have been here. Hale stood and walked toward the viewport. His reflection stared back at him. Sharp eyes, scarred face, the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders. We should have seen it coming, Hale said quietly. Vickers opened his eyes. What? The Valtteri, Hale said. They're not done. Harris sat up straighter. They said they'd withdraw. Hale's gaze remained sharp. They're licking their wounds, but they'll come back. His eyes hardened. Next time, they'll be smarter, stronger. Then we'll be ready, Harris said. Hale's gaze darkened. We better be. The dropship passed the remains of a destroyed human battleship. Its hull was scorched, its engines torn apart by plasma fire. The broken remains of human bodies floated in the wreckage, illuminated by the dim light of distant stars. Hale's chest tightened. We won this battle, he said. His voice was low. But the war isn't over. Park's voice cut through the quiet. Commander, incoming transmission. Hale's eyes sharpened. From who? Park's gaze darkened. Earth Command. Hale's jaw tightened. Put it through. A figure appeared on the screen, a high-ranking officer in Earth's military. His face was pale, his eyes hard. Commander Hale, the officer said. Sir, Hale replied. You've done well, the officer said. The Valtteri have agreed to a ceasefire. Human colonies are secure. For now. Hale's gaze sharpened. For now. The officer's gaze darkened. We've received intelligence reports. Valtteri fleets are regrouping on the far side of the sector. His expression tightened. They're preparing for another offensive. Hale's jaw clenched. When? Unknown, the officer said. But you can assume they'll come back harder. Hale's gaze narrowed. Then we'll be ready. The officer's eyes flickered toward the viewport. How many did we lose? Too many, Hale said quietly. The officer's expression darkened. Your team. Cole's gone, Hale said. His voice was hard and sharp. The others survived. The officer's gaze softened slightly. We'll honor the dead, he said. We dan well better, Hale replied. The transmission ended. Hale's gaze returned to the viewport. The stars stretched endlessly before them, cold and distant. His hand closed around Cole's dog tags. His chest tightened. "Commander." Harris's voice was quiet. Hale's gaze didn't shift. "Yes." "What happens now?" Harris asked. Hale's eyes darkened. "Now," Hale said. His voice was sharp and cold. "Now we prepare for the next war." Outside the viewport, the darkness of space stretched infinitely ahead. The quiet hum of the ship's engines filled the silence. Hale's gaze remained fixed on the stars, and far in the distance, the broken remnants of the Volteri fleet drifted into the void.